Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. It feels like just recently we took a close look at the class of warriors, which have been progressing and improving and growing stronger and stronger over on the 11.1 PTR, but it looks like for some reason they decided to bust out another set of warrior buffs all across the board with this most recent build. 11.1 Season 2 content is releasing in 3 weeks. Well, really, patch 11.1 is releasing in 2 weeks, but then seasonal content begins a week afterwards, and now's the time for them to start tuning classes, nerfs where necessary, buffs where needed, and it looks like they're continuing to buff up warriors again and again and again over these past few weeks, as all 3 specs, Fury, Arms, and Protection, continue to get amped up and juiced heading into this brand new update. And I wanted to really go over this culmination of changes the Warriors have gotten as they got yet another buff this week, and it's actually starting to get a little out of control, where some classes like popular picks like Beastmaster Hunter and Enhancement Shaman are starting to get some initial nerfs. Warriors are getting buffs after buffs after buffs, and I really want to dive in a little bit closer into exactly all of the changes coming to this class so far. As always, if you guys want to keep up with all the regular class changes for the patch 11.1, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right into these brand new improvements. Alright, my warrior friends, we gotta talk about these buffs. Now, the PTR is full of weird things this week specifically. For some reason, most of my characters, when I'm looking at their tier set gear, it's all... Normally, items are around 678 item level, or maybe, a little lower, depending on the items, but... For some reason, my tier set gear is at 730 item level. This doesn't necessarily really matter too much when you're inside of dungeons or raids or PvP, because there's scaling involved and it scales your gear to a certain level. Whether it's higher, lower, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, so the numbers are a little funky. The tooltips may be a little bit wild, and the health numbers may be a little weird, but within dungeons, warriors are slamming and doing quite a lot of damage as of recently. Now I'm going to break this down going from Arms, Fury, then Prod, because all 3 specs saw a variety of buffs, starting with the spec of Arms. To give you a bit of a refresher, earlier in weeks, Arms saw a buff towards a bunch of their abilities. Things like the Mortal Strike buffed up by 20%, Cleave buffed up by 10%, Overpower as well as Dreadnought Talent both buffed up by 20%, Slam buffed by 30%, which isn't amazing, but Slam is a decent portion of your single target damage when you're not spamming Mortal Strike, so Overpower, like, it is a button that you'll press, it's just a raw single target gain. It's not super consequential. It does technically show up with Fervor for Battle, and Slam does do a little bit of damage overall when it comes to a dungeon. Not going to be crazy, but it still is a gain either way, as well as Execute buffed up by 10% for Arms Warriors. So that was the initial set of buffs, which looked like it was really good. But all of a sudden, Blizzard decided, let's just go juice up Arms even further. So on top of the original buffs, Mortal Strike got a 20% buff on top of that. Don't look at the tooltips, things are going to be wonky because I have way too... How much strength do I have, actually? I have 110,000 strength. That does seem like a little bit high with some of these items giving me a lot of stamina. I mean, this is giving me more stamina than my weapon. This is giving me more strength than my weapon, so the item levels are a little bit high, so yeah, it's going to be a little weird, but... Overpower, Mortal Strike buffed by 20%. Execute further buffed up by 20% for Arms only. Only Arms Warriors, not Fury, not Prod this time around. Slam, the ability got buffed up by 30%. 20% on top of it this week as well. And they also buffed up Whirlwind. Now, Whirlwind is an ability, something that gets replaced by Cleave, especially if you're playing the Colossus build, because there's a direct interaction there. The buff to Whirlwind is actually on its own not the worst buff ever, and it does end up allowing the Slayer playstyle to shine a little bit better, because that's most likely or potentially the button that you could pick up in that build. Colossus, you locked into Cleave, but outside of it, your Whirlwind would hit for a decent bit. Damage doesn't seem to be scaling super well. There are interactions with Slayer and Bladestorm. There's not too many interactions with Slayer and Whirlwind in particular, but you can play around with Bladestorm, as well as things like, not necessarily Dance of Death, but Mercer's Bone Grinder, where Whirlwind or Cleave can deal additional damage after Ravager or Bladestorm ends, with you getting constant resets on your Bladestorm. This could be a pretty decent combo to at least put out in AoE altogether. However, it does look like Arms Warriors are, maybe I'm wrong here, but it does seem like a lot of them are gravitating towards Colossus. To be fair, when it comes to dungeon content within 11.1, we're seeing a lot more Fury Warriors than we are seeing Arms Warriors. But the few arms that are there, which it might just be like, you know, not as many people are on PTR, not as many players are picking up different specs, everybody just tries to play what is meta, and everybody heard that Fury is really, really good, so maybe that's why we're not seeing as much representation for Arms. It doesn't necessarily mean that Arms is looking bad heading forward into this update, because none of the tuning is really final. When you do look at Arms Warriors, you are seeing a lot of them playing Colossus in Mythic Plus over Slayer, and it does feel like Colossus just feels naturally better, at least with the current setup, and it feels really, really good to play, really fun to play. But they ended up buffing up both Colossus and Slayer in their own ways. For Colossus, they ended up taking the ability of Demolish and buffed up all aspects of it, all Demolish damage through the minor abilities, to the cleave damage, to the big build-up ability, all of them buffed up by 30%. So now the Demolish ability can hit for quite a bit of damage. It is so strong. And what's cool about it is it works with sweep and strike, so you can actually sweep multiple targets with the Demolish ability. And the cleave, oh, again, the numbers are a little overtuned right now, but man, it's satisfying. It is very satisfying button to press, and in dungeon situations, it does so much. I'm a big fan of this button in particular. It's just so impactful. It has such high impact, and I've been a huge fan of it. Now, besides that, Colossus gets further buffed up depending on the talent builds that you're running for. Like Talent or Practice Strikes further buffs up the damage of Immortal Strike and Cleave, increasing it by 20%, initially increased by 15%. And with some of the recent changes they've done to Mortal Strike, where they wanted for you to make it a fun forward ability, something you want to press as soon as it's available in single target or cleave situations, they ended up buffing this ability by quite a bit, to the point where you don't even have to like delay and amp up it up with overpower and amp it up with execution precision. You actually just get to send it more regularly, and that's going to be further amplified by 20% on top of it. Cleave also got buffed up by quite a bit too, so going from 15 to 20% more damage on top of these other buffs really makes the two abilities feel very satisfying to use, especially when they get resets with exhilarating blows. I didn't realize that I was missing this talent in my build, and I think I want to put this as part of every build of Arms. Just feels super satisfying when you get those resets. Maybe that's just the outlaw in me that is a big fan of like very satisfying RNG elements. But also, if you end up playing instead of one against many that increases Shockwave, Cleave, and Whirlwind damage, you can also pick up Arterial Bleeding, where Colossus might well now also increase your bleed damage of rend and deep wounds by 5% per stack instead of 3. And with the actual buffs of Colossus might stack it up to 10 times, it's quite a bit of additional damage. So if you do want to play your Arms Warrior with a little bit more sustained damage, with a bit more of this periodic bleed damage, there's some opportunity for that as well, which I've always enjoyed. While Arms is not necessarily a big bleed damage kind of a playstyle, I like how it has the opportunity to go into maybe a little bit more bleed heaviness depending on your build. As for Slayer, however, I was hoping we'd see even more updates for Slayer in terms of damage, but for the most part didn't really do too much in terms of some of its basic talents. They did end up buffing up Opportunist a little bit, where the actual damage and critical strike damage of your overpower is now being juiced up to 25% instead of 20%, which is going to be helpful. But I don't really know. It's hard to tell if Slayer is going to be the go-to choice or Colossus. At least in Mythic Plus, Colossus feels really good. But if Slayer does go into it with some of these buffs to overpower and having it do more crit damage, that could be an excellent synergy if Slayer ends up being a viable choice going forward. I don't really want to say which one is looking the best or which one is going to be the best. Final tuning is going to be final tuning, and Blizzard usually does that towards the tail end of development cycle. We are still in PTR for the next 2 weeks, and then we have a week before Season 1 launches, and then, or Season 2 launches, and then a week into the Heroic Week, Mythic Week, so it's going to be plenty of opportunity for them to adjust the numbers. But yeah, it looks like both Slayer, Colossus, either way, the Arms Warrior has gotten juiced up over these past few weeks, and right now in PTR it feels incredible to play with. Though the only spec that outmatches Arms in terms of just raw fun when it comes to AoE content is Fury Warrior. So initially, Fury got a damage buff towards the Bloodbath as well as Bloodthirst. A lot of the playstyle is going to end up buffing some of the abilities within Reckless Abandon. So basically, you're going to have like double versions of these abilities, like Bloodbath and Bloodthirst are essentially the same ability. But when you activate the new version of Reckless Abandon, when you press Recklessness and you get this empowered version of these abilities, those are also going to be the ones that are getting amped up over these past few weeks. So, like I was mentioning, Bloodthirst as well as Bloodbath buffed up by 20%, Raging Blow as well as its Crushing Blow, Reckless Abandon version buffed up by 20%, Rampage damage buffed up by 20%, and Odin's Fury by 15%, which we haven't really seen, at least this week. This week I haven't seen Odin's Fury coming back up as a build. Some players have started to experiment with it a little bit more, but I haven't really seen players like really fully invest into it. This seems to be the Fury Warrior build that I've seen a lot of Fury Warriors spec into. However, at some point they decided to end up juicing Fury just a little bit more. These were a bunch of hot fixes for Fury that didn't necessarily make it into a blue post or an official post, but they did end up getting added, and I haven't heard about them removing them or backtracking on these at all, so I'm pretty sure this is still in the game on PTR. What they did for those secret hotfixes is amped up execute damage for Fury by 50%, 5-0, just massive chopper added into it. Bloodthirst further amplified by 15%, Bloodbath buffed up by 20 instead of 15, but now they changed the dot scaling of it, so the dot ticks a little bit differently, which apparently results in a slight damage nerf for that dot ability specifically. Rage Blow buffed up further by 20%, Crushing Blow by 20, but then they also made it so that Crushing Blow has a 20% additional critical strike damage component on top of it, which could maybe be really good with a crit-based build for a Fury Warrior. And Rampage on top of all that got buffed up by 20% on top of it. What looks like they're trying to do for Fury Warrior is really trying to balance out Anger Management build and Reckless Abandon. Anger Management is going to focus on Raging Blow, Bloodthirst, Rampage, and pretty high uptime of Recklessness, whereas Reckless Abandon is going to focus on huge Crushing Blows, huge Bloodbath, but with a cooldown that lasts for about 1.5 minutes. And every 1.5 minutes you have massive burst, and then your damage kind of wanes afterwards. So they're trying to balance the sustained damage and then heavy burst damage build of Fury. So it's going to be interesting to see how that ends up panning out over these next few weeks. So that was a lot of damage buffs with Fury for us to go over, and then this week they decided to buff it even further. What they did this week specifically is buff the damage of your Whirlwind, which depending on if you're playing a Mountain Thane build or if you're playing the Slayer build, you're either using Whirlwind to deal, I guess, AoE damage to enable Cleave, or this is like your final ability that you would just use when nothing else is available as a Rage builder. But primarily it is your main primary Cleave ability thanks to improved Whirlwind. Mountain Thane doesn't necessarily use this ability, but it's really just a buff towards the Slayer playstyle of Fury, which does end up using Whirlwind since Mountain Thane is all about stomping around with the Thunderclap ability, or rather the empowered version called Thunder Blast. Outside of this, the Onslaught also got buffed up by 30%, which is quite huge because Onslaught I felt like was not really seen a lot of play, although it can be a really good burst ability, and in PvP it generally ends up being very, very strong because of the ability for it to immediately enrage you, but also grant you new slaughtering strikes, which can be further amplify the rest of your damage kit and allow you for some faster, better bursts. So both of those got buffed up by 30%, but then they decided that Mountain Thane probably could use another buff or two. Even though this is a popular choice for dungeons as is, I thought, let's just juice it up once more, why not? So the actual damage of your Thunder Blast, the transform version of your Thunder Stomp, now does 25% more damage. And this ability already kind of hit a decent bit. I mean, together with the lightning bolts and everything, Mountain Thane does quite a lot of damage. Although they did see a slight nerf in the Mountain Thane playstyle. I think this Thunder Blast damage maybe is there to make sure that that ability is your higher priority ability once it's lit up. Once you have the Thunder Blast, you use it as soon as it's available to make it something that you prioritize as soon as possible. Though Strength of the Mountain does see a slight reduction, where Bloodthirst and Rampage damage used to be increased by 30%, now increased by 25%, which isn't the biggest loss, honestly, because of some of these recent buffs to Fury. But I think what they're trying to do is trying to make Mountain Thane and Slayer a little bit more even with one another, and that's been a very difficult thing because Slayer still maintains to be a pretty decent like single target raid option for Fury, while Mountain Thane generally ends up being a good AoE option. And I feel like the two just do two different things, and trying to balance them has been a very, very difficult task for them unless they could find a way for them to kind of blend the gameplay of the two so both have some single target and AoE value. I don't really know if they'll be effective at it, but yeah, Mountain Thane generally did get buffed up with all these Fury buffs. And you thought we were done, but we got more, as Protection saw a 20% ability damage buff all across the board. In fact, all tanks saw some kind of a damage buff, whether it's 20%, whether it is 15%. What they mentioned is they noticed the damage dealt by tanks has not been keeping pace with damage dealers, and are adjusting this damage of all tank specs to bring them into closer alignment with the DPS specs. What this does is accomplishes a couple of things. As a tank, it's all about holding aggro to make sure that the DPS cannot rip that aggro, and DPS and tanks, as season progresses, usually have to combat the whole DPS get more damage so they can get a lot of snap aggro very quickly, and the tanks that have to wrestle that aggro from them. So amping up the damage of all tank abilities doesn't change the tank structure, but allows them to be more effective and more likely to maintain that aggro away from the DPS players, which can be very helpful for certain tank specs like Guardian Druid, which can sometimes be a little rampy with its damage. So like if you put Guardian Druid and a Fire Mage together, Fire Mage get immediate big burst damage from the get-go, while Guardian Druid has to ramp up unless it pop massive offensive cooldowns. So this will help them to be able to have an easy time wrestling against the aggro. But also tank damage also doesn't become completely cosmetic and valueless in the grand scheme of endgame content. Like in a raid or a dungeon, tank damage should be consequential, so this damage buff also helps tanks retain that relevancy when it comes to endgame content. When it comes to protection warriors, we also see some changes to, well, slight buffs towards the hero specs, primarily Mountain Thane. I was really hoping they would do something for Colossus, and technically there are some Colossus warrior builds, at least when it comes to raids, that can output a bit of decent single target damage. Though, for the most part, when it comes to player choice, a lot of players stick with Mountain Thane, and ends up being a very solid option with quite a lot of survivability, but also quite a bit of decent damage overall, and Mountain Thane saw further buffs. I was really hoping they would do something to make Colossus more accepted. It technically is a decent option for PvP content because of its immediate damage with Demolish, so I guess it does have some usage there, but for the most part, Mountain Thane just reigns supreme. And they ended up buffing the damage of the Thunderblast ability of Mountain Thane, which is pretty much core bread and butter towards the Mountain Thane playstyle. They buffed that by 10%, so I guess we're still going to see Protection Warriors spec into Mountain Thane, unless we see some huge changes or reworks towards the Colossus protection and how that ends up functioning overall. As always, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy this video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community, probably the best place to keep up with all the up-to-date, immediate changes when it comes to 11.1 as we go over and discuss it with the community fairly regularly. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.